Hello, Rob. We're back with Tried for Life. Don't know what chapter I'm on. I'm lost in the amidst the books. I don't know how long this goes on either. Chapter 18. How Sybil Received Her Death Warrant. She looked on many a face with vacant eye, on many a token without knowing what. She saw them watch her without asking why, and recked hot who around her pillow sat, and recked not who around her pillow sat. Byron. The warden unlocked the door and entered the cell, followed by the sheriff and Mr. Berners. Sybil was dressed, but lying on the outside of her bed. Beatrix was sitting beside her, engaged in some light needlework. "She is very feeble both in mind and body today," said Beatrix in answer to an inquiring look of Mr. Berners as she arose to give him her seat by the bedside. "How are you this morning, love?" inquired Mr. Berners, tenderly taking her hand. "Oh, I am better. Shall we go home tomorrow, Lion?" "If it please Providence, dear," answered her husband, putting a strong constraint upon himself. But he saw that though she had asked the question, she scarcely heard his answer. Her attention had wandered from the point, and she was idly pulling the curly-haired ears of her little dog, who lay coiled up beside her. Meanwhile, Mr. Fortescue had shaken hands with Miss Pendleton, and was now saying, "Beatrix, my child, you had better retire from this scene for a few moments." "Why?" inquired Beatrix, looking her old neighbor firmly in the face. "Because I have a very painful duty to perform, which will be very distressing to you to witness." "What is it?" inquired Miss Pendleton, without removing her eyes from his face. The sheriff stood and told her in a whisper. She turned pale as death, caught her breath, and leaned for an instant on the table near her. Then, with a supreme effort, she stood up and said, "You have known me from my childhood. Do you think me such a dastard as to desert my friend in the hour of her utmost need? No, Mr. Fortescue, I will stand by Sybil to the last. So do your duty. Thank heaven, you cannot hurt her much." "Thank heaven, indeed, if that is so, Beatrix," answered the sheriff, as he made a sign to Mr. Berners and approached the bed with the death warrant in his hand. "Sybil, darling," whispered her agonized husband, "here is Mr. Fortescue come to see you." "Has he? That is kind," she answered, looking curiously at her own fingers, and then forgetting the presence of her visitors. "How are you, Mrs. Berners?" inquired the sheriff. "I am better. I am going home tomorrow, and then you must come," and she broke off suddenly and began to feel about with her fingers over the white counterpane. "Good heaven!" exclaimed the sheriff, looking up into Mrs. Berners' face. Lion Berners gravely bent his head. The sheriff hesitated, as if uncertain how to proceed. Mr. Berners came to his side and whispered, "If you must read the document to her, be merciful and read it now, when her mind is dulled to its meaning." The sheriff nodded and then said, "Mrs. Berners, I have something to read to you. Can you listen?" "Yes." "Is it interesting?" inquired Sybil, rousing herself. Without answering that last question, the sheriff prepared to read the awful instrument of doom. Lion Berners sat down on the side of the bed and drew his wife's head upon his bosom. Miss Pendleton sat pale and still as a statue. Sybil roused herself to listen, and she heard the first few lines of preamble addressed to the sheriff, but after that her attention wandered beyond control, and at the conclusion she slightly smiled, and turning to her husband said, "Lion, be sure to come early tomorrow. I want to go home in the cool of the morning." "Yes, dear, I shall be here very early," answered Mr. Berners as steadily as he could speak, with his heart breaking. Then, laying her gently back on her pillow, he touched the sheriff on the shoulder and beckoned him to follow to the window. "You see," said Mr. Berners, as they stood side by side looking out. "I see. I am very much shocked. This should be looked into. A medical examination should be made. Another appeal should be sent to the governor. Has Mr. Worth returned to Washington?" "No, he has been waiting the issue of the petition to the governor." "Then I advise you to see and consult him without loss of time. Do it now, this morning," urged the sheriff, as he took his hat and gloves to leave the cell. He went to Sybil's bedside to take leave of her. "Good morning, Mrs. Berners," he said, holding out his hand. "Good morning, Mr. Fortescue. Thanks for your call. When you come again," she began, smiling, but lost the connection of her ideas, and with a look of distress and perplexity, she sent her fingers straying over the counterpane, as if in search of something. With a deep sigh, the sheriff left the cell. And at the same time, Lion Berners quietly kissed his wife and withdrew. Mr. Berners went at once to the hotel where Ishmael Worth lodged. On inquiry at the office, he found that Mr. Worth was in his room. Without waiting to send up his name first, he desired to be immediately shown up to Mr. Worth's presence. He found the young lawyer sitting at a table, deeply immersed in documents. He was about to apologize for his unceremonious intrusion when Mr. Worth arose, and with grave courtesy and earnest sympathy informed his visitor that he had already heard with deep sorrow the adverse decision of the governor. Mr. Berners covered his face with his hand for a moment, and then sank into the chair placed for him by Mr. Worth. As soon as he had recovered himself, he entered upon the subject of his visit, the insanity of SYBIL, and the use that might be made of it in gaining a respite that should prolong her life for some months, until perhaps she might be permitted to die a natural death. Her state, as you represent it, gives me hopes of obtaining not only a respite, but a full pardon, said Ishmael Worth, when Mr. Berners had finished his account. I scarcely dared to hope as much as that, sighed Mr. Berners. I must speak now from the law's point of view. You and I believe that, sane or insane, Mrs. Berners never committed that murder, but the jury says she did. Now, if she can be proved to be insane at this time, her present insanity will argue a foregone conclusion, namely, that she was insane at the time she is said to have committed the crime, and if insane, then she was therefore irresponsible for her action, and unamenable to the laws. Let this be satisfactorily proved and properly set before the governor, and I have little doubt that the result will be a full pardon. You give me hope where I thought hope was impossible. If we can only obtain this pardon and get my dear wife out of her horrible position, I will take her at once to some foreign country where, far from all these ghastly associations, she may live in peace and possibly recover her reason, and where she may have some little share of earthly happiness. Even yet, sighed Lion Berners, and if it can be shown that there has been insanity in her family, it will make our argument much stronger. Has such ever been the case? Earnestly inquired Ishmael Worth. Ah, no. Unless the most violent passions roused at times to the most ungovernable fury and resulting in the most heinous deeds can be called insanity, there is none in her family, said Mr. Berners, sadly shaking his head. That is also insanity, certainly, said the philosophical Ishmael Worth, but scarcely of the sort that could be brought forward in her favor. Nor is it the type of her present mental malady, which is very, very gentle. However, we have ground enough to go upon. Our case is very strong. We must lose no time, even though it says lost no time. See, you can't blame me for making mistakes when the actual editor did. We must lose no time. The first step to be taken will be to procure an order to have the lady examined by physicians competent to form a judgment and make a report upon her condition. The report must go up to the governor with the petition for her pardon. And now, Mr. Berners, if you will go home and seek the rest you need and leave this business in my hands, I will set about it immediately. And Ishmael Worth kindly, thank you. I thank you from my soul. I will confidently leave her fate in your hands. I know I could not leave it in any better under heaven. But tell me, when shall I see you again? Tomorrow morning after your visit to the prison, you can call here if you please, and I shall be able to report some progress, said Mr. Worth, rising from his chair. Lion Berners then shook hands with him and left the room. Not to go home and rest as he had been advised. There was no rest for Sybil's husband. There could be none now. He went to wander around and around her prison walls until the day declined and the sky darkened. And then, indeed, he turned his steps homeward, walking all the way to Blackhall, because in his mental excitement he could not sit still in carriage or saddle. There he passed the night in sleeplessness and horror, imagination favored by the darkness, the stillness, and the loneliness of the scene, conjured up all the ghastly spectres of the future, impending tragedies, and nearly drove him into frenzy. He started up from his bed and walked out into the summer night under the shining stars and wandered up and down the wooded banks of the river until morning. Then he returned to the house, and after a hasty breakfast, which for him consisted only of a cup of very strong coffee, he set out for Blackville. He reached the prison before its doors were opened to visitors, and he waited until he could be admitted. He found Sybil placid, peaceful, and unconscious of imprisonment and deadly peril of her life as she had ever been. He spent an hour with her, and then he went to the hotel to see Mr. Worth. He found the young lawyer in good spirits. "I have made much progress, Mr. Berners. I succeeded in procuring the order for the medical examination. It is appointed for tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Dr. Bright, Dr. Hart, and Dr. Wiseman are the physicians authorized to make it. They have all been notified and are to meet at the prison at the hour specified," said Ishmael Worth, as he shook hands with his visitor and offered him a chair. Lion Berners warmly expressed his thanks and sank into the seat. "You look very ill, Mr. Berners. You look as if you had not slept for many nights. That will not do. Let me be your physician for once, as well as your lawyer. Let me advise you to take opium at night. You must sleep, you see." "Thanks, but I think my malady beyond the help of medicine, Mr. Worth, unless it were something that should send me into the eternal sleep," said Lion Berners mournfully. Come, take courage. We have every reason to believe that this medical examination will result in such a report as, sent up to the governor with the new petition, will ensure her release, and then you will carry out your purpose of going with her to some foreign country. Gay France, beautiful Italy, classic Greece, good old England are all before you where to choose," said Ishmael Worth cheerfully. Then they spoke of the three physicians who were to conduct the examination. Dr. Bright, who had once had charge of the state insane asylum, but who had recently retired to his plantation in this neighborhood. Dr. Hart, who was the oldest and most skillful practitioner in the county, having attended more families and first introduced more children to their friends and relations than any other man in the place. And lastly, Dr. Wiseman, the village druggist who had taken his degree and was also physician to the county prison. Dr. Hart has attended Sybil's family for nearly half a century. He has known Sybil from her earliest infancy. His visit will not alarm her, though. For that matter, nothing alarms her now, not even. He did not finish the sentence. He could not bear to utter the words that would have completed it. Soon after, he arose and took his leave, and he passed the day and night as he had passed the last in many previous days and nights. And that brings us to the conclusion. We shall return with chapter 19 next time, Robs. Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.